Dear friends, today we're going to be talking to Matthew Ehret. Matthew has written several books. He is an investigator. He knows everything about history and geopolitics, and he's going to help give us a context to what we're currently experiencing with the pandemic. There is, of course, a backdrop to this. There's a geopolitical and, of course, there's a historical backdrop to this, and Matthew knows what this is. So let's see what he can tell us. We've known each other for quite a while now. One of these days, Matt, we're going to have a beer or wine together. But in the meantime, let's just keep exposing what needs to be exposed.
Well, I look forward to that day where we get to finally meet face to face with a beer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Reiner. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time with me today. And I've taken the opportunity of pulling together a few slides, a few quotes. I try to avoid making my presentations too quote heavy, but I try to select only those things that would advance the drama. And I think that's been a very useful bit of advice that I was given some years ago when I was trying to make sense of what the hell is Canada. That was an early thing, a question in 2007. When I began to get a sense, just a couple of years earlier, that the official stories, the big mythologies that we were given and we were expected to adapt to, were controlled, coordinated lies, effectively. Now, whether people began looking at the broader issue of conspiracy facts from the standpoint of the lies that were covering up what really went down on 9/11, which was my sort of shakeup. Or whether it was the more recent issue of medical lies that really turned a lot of lives upside down over the past 3 years. There's a lot of points. Some people got in earlier and started questioning what was really behind John F. Kennedy's murder or his brother, and quickly began to realize that the official narratives that were being parroted by high-level academic and media personalities was actually just a lie. There was a deeper reality to be discovered, and anybody with an inquiring mind and a sense of care for truth would be able to find these things. You didn't have to be a PhD. You didn't have to spend years and years in academia in order to have an opinion that could be worth entertaining on any of these matters. Just any human being could use the God-given reason that we were born with to cultivate and employ it to make discoveries and share them. And it's a bit scary at some points. It's a bit depressing, but it's also a bit empowering, because if, the way I was thinking about it was, well, if it's discoverable by somebody who's not really a special person, I wasn't born into a special family, I didn't have a special education, nothing. I'm just a regular Joe. And if a low quality mind like me could discover some very big things that most people don't seem to know about, well, then that means I can also learn how to communicate it through reason and get better at it, which I set my mind to. So back to my original problem was, what the hell is Canada? Why are we the monarchy of North America? Why didn't we accept Ben Franklin's offers to join with the other 13 colonies and for the first time declare a new type of nation free of hereditary powers of control, which is what the early founding of the U.S. was, right? It was the first time a nation was founded on the idea that all men are created equal. Even though it took some time to start actualizing that in practice, the idea is solid, and that the idea of law and authority comes from the consent of the governed for the sake of the general welfare, both for today but also into posterity, as outlined in both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Very, very powerful ideas, which all reject the concepts that had been dominant for a very long time of hereditary power, that hereditary institutions, the might must be the source of law and rights, which can be given or taken away by whoever is born into positions of prestige. So why did we miss out on that? What really has been shaping the past 250-year experience known as Canada, but also that brought me into a better appreciation of a global chemistry? That most narratives shaping Canada, or are the myth makers that maintain and promulgate the myths of what shapes our identity in Canada, take things from a very Canadian-centric standpoint, and they ignore the real global great game, the reality of the fact that we have been living under systems of oligarchism, of these hereditary powers for a long time. The center of world government was localized primarily in the City of London. The City of London, just like today, was back in 1776 the world global financial nerve center. That's not a new thing. That goes back then too. The British East India Company, after having merged with the Dutch East India Company, was the first multinational corporation with its own private mercenary force integrated deeply with the British Parliament. These were two sides of the same thing, coordinated by British intelligence, the British Foreign Office, which is what people like Ben Franklin and other founding fathers, who were much smarter than many of the statesmen we have today, they understood this and they carried out a battle on that level of sophistication, which I think we've taken for granted. So Canada was always a part of this broader chemistry. And unfortunately, when you look at the murder of John F. Kennedy or Lincoln, what we tend to find, and this is conducted in some of my books on the untold history of Canada, these could not have occurred were it not for British-Canadian operations that deployed people like John Wilkes Booth, that managed the Confederacy intelligence operations in Montreal and Toronto and Kingston, running terrorist activity to destroy Lincoln's Union from the north while he was still trying to keep the thing together, fighting another British-controlled Confederacy in the south. And only one of those two British-controlled Confederacy operations succeeded, which was Canada. The southern operation failed. In some ways, though, many of those slave power fanatics, I will say, were not only just like many of the leading Nazis and Italian fascists who did some of the worst atrocities in World War II, in the same way that those fascists were not punished in Nuremberg, but were reabsorbed by Anglo-American intelligence under Allen Dulles, Reinhard Gehlen being just one of many high-level Nazi SS officials who were absorbed into NATO's secret armies, into managing West German intelligence throughout the Cold War. In the same way that you had these unreconstructed stay-behinds operate and were continuously used throughout the entirety of the Cold War. In the same sense, you had many of the unreconstructed fanatics who managed much of the war and of the Confederacy attempt to create a new type of peculiar society that would always be loyal economically as well as value-wise to the British Empire and High Command. They were unreconstructed and redeployed, like Albert Pike, a Confederate high-level general, to be a figure who played a big role after the Civil War, always in the same sort of function, having co-created things like the KKK out of the Knights of the Golden Circle, the world's first, I think, or at least modern, domestic terror cell controlled by intelligence agencies. He was also the figure who wrote Morals and Dogma in the 1870s that redrafted the behavior and the constructs of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, a big part of the indoctrination in fifth column of American operatives who would then be loyal to things like the British Foreign Office after the Civil War. So Canada was used in a variety of ways to undermine the United States. I mentioned JFK, and people just need to read Jim Garrison's book from 1991, The District Attorney of New Orleans, who wrote On the Trail of the Assassins to have their minds blown, and review Garrison's research that took it all the way to Montreal and an organization known as Permanent Industrial Exposition, a British intelligence front operation specializing in assassinations, which was at the heart of the JFK murder and cover-up, as well as, in a funny way, the World Trade Center takedown, but that's another story. So all that to say, this is a big intro for a bit of a big presentation as far as idea content, at least, is concerned.
Very
so I'm going to do a little
Very
screen
good.
share.
Matt, Jim Garrison was the prosecutor on the JFK murder, wasn't he? Or did he come in afterwards?
Yeah, he was the district attorney of New Orleans who ran the only jury trial into the murder of JFK in 1966, which Oliver Stone did a very good treatment of this, featuring Kevin Costner playing the role of Jim Garrison in 1992. Very good film, and despite the FBI infiltration into Garrison's team, which undermined a lot of the advances that Garrison was making, he did bring a lot of things to the surface. Not only the Zapruder film that he was able to acquire from a vault that was affiliated with a Henry Luce Time magazine organization which had withheld that very important bit of footage demonstrating that the kill shot that murdered JFK came from the front, not from behind, overthrowing the entire official narrative. So he did bring a lot of these things to the surface, but he also traced some of the leading organizers to a figure named Clay Shaw, who ran a Trademart. He was a director of Trademart, which was affiliated with Louis Mortimer Bloomfield and a broader international web around Permindex that I just referred to very briefly. But there was certain incriminating footage that only came out later, basically photographs that featured Clay Shaw and David Ferry, a handler of Lee Harvey Oswald, a poor schlub. He didn't know what the hell was going on half the time. And there were incriminating documents and photographs pulling both Clay Shaw and Ferry together, but they were only revealed years later. And at the time, Clay Shaw, part of his defense, relied upon him never having met David Ferry, and thus the jury was forced to conclude that Clay Shaw couldn't be found guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt, and he was acquitted. But Jim Garrison his research was just impeccable, and he devoted the last 28 years of his life to the truth. And he did a very good job pulling it all together, which is why at the very end of his life, he did get to see his works published with Trail of the Assassins, a wonderful book, very, very high value that people should read. So I didn't
mean to throw you off course. I just asked because a lot of people probably don't know him unless they've seen the movie. And I also asked because we're going to do an interview very soon with Mark Grubert, who is going to explain to us and our viewers about Operation Paperclip. And in that context, he mentioned, I saw him do an interview, or he was being interviewed by Eric, I forget his last name, and he mentioned a person who was in charge of Operation, I forget his name, Operation Paperclip, who was also involved in the assassination of JFK, and who was also involved in setting up the CIA, and who was also involved in the Warner Commission, which tried to get to the bottom of it, but find out the truth of what happened in the JFK thing. I forget the name of this guy, but it'll be interesting when we talk to Mark Grubert. But I didn't want to throw you off.
He's probably referring to Alan Dulles.
There's someone else, but
someone else. Okay,
we'll see.
I'll send you. Yeah, I look forward to that interview. I'll definitely keep my eyes peeled for your upcoming shows. So, okay, let's do a little screen share here. And since I'm in the British Commonwealth Territory of Canada, I thought it would be very useful to begin this presentation. Oopsie daisy, this is not right at all. Somehow it's beginning at the end, which is not the way I wanted it. I'm hoping people didn't absorb too much of that in their subconscious.
Okay, this is great. This is a great beginning. I love this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the focus and curiosity for people has been piqued a little bit about what the hell was that thing we had been forced to be exposed to in almost every branch of entertainment, of media, a couple of weeks ago with the coronation of King Charles III. First time we saw a coronation in 70 years. Most people never saw one before. It was weird. It was very expensive. A lot of pomp and regalia. And it featured, such foolish imagery as this character being trotted out, with all sorts of, beads and gems stolen from India and other countries of the world, and holding one of these orbs indicating the Earth. I mean, it's an orb in reference to Charlemagne, who painted, had himself painted holding an orb. And frankly, just as a disclaimer, I like Charlemagne. I think he was a good guy. I think he was operating with the mandate of heaven as a human being who actually believed in the sacredness of humans. So his claim to authority in the 9th century might have had a bit more validity than the misanthropic death cultists trying to utilize the authority of law to manage the human herd today. And unfortunately, this fellow Charles, though his name is derived from Charlemagne, has very little to do with that namesake that he has found himself. He has probably more in common with the figure of Charles I, maybe, who lost his head in a certain Republican revolution attempt in the 17th century Britain. That being said, he's certainly got a track record as a figure who has walked in his father's footsteps as the president of the British World Wildlife Fund for Nature. He has himself expressed a certain Malthusian idea that human population is something which isn't qualitatively different from the animals as far as population limits are concerned. His father is somebody who was a little bit more blatant and sloppy with his tongue, who would often say things like, human beings are just like the game herds, and you wouldn't want to maintain more animals on your game, whatever it is, than you could possibly afford to feed or maintain. And occasionally the leaders of society must cull the herd. Don't you know? Wink, wink. So that's Prince Philip, the guy who said he'd like to be reborn as a deadly virus to solve overpopulation. Mm-hmm. That guy. So his son very much admires people like his father. I think he also admires people like Jimmy Savile, one of his mentors and his father's close friend, who people could just Google Jimmy Savile and be shocked about that one. I won't say anything there.
Pedophilia.
But, I'd like people to really think about what is this? And as I pose as a question there, is this just an absurd relic of a bygone age of medievalism? Or is it the expression of actual global power? Or is it maybe a bit of both? And punchline, yes, in my contention, it is a bit of both. The resource, since I'm going to be just scratching the surface of some ideas that I've been writing about for some time, if people want to dig in a little bit more deeply, just so you know, I've written 4 big books with the help of my wife, Cynthia. They're all there. They can go to CanadianPatriot.org to review some of the material in greater detail of what I'm going to go through today. So I'm just putting it out there for people to think about. Prince Charles. So he's also a devoted fan of the World Economic Forum. World Economic Forum was founded in 1971. Klaus Schwab being a prodigy of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger having been his teacher at Harvard, a CIA-sponsored program on international affairs that talent searches young sociopaths, of which Klaus Schwab was one of those. I don't know whether you want to call it fortunate or unfortunate. He was picked up and assigned a certain role to carry out the creation of a sort of junior Bilderberger group. And that 1971 operation, it got its sort of start. The idea of stakeholder capitalism in the Davos Manifesto was introduced soon thereafter, in 1973, at the 3rd Annual Summit, funded and patroned by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who is the primary financier of the 3rd Davos Forum, which is also the same forum that brought in the Club of Rome's computer models officially. Aurelio Peccei, a co-director of the Club of Rome, along with Sir Alexander King, was brought in to showcase this absurd idea of effectively controlling global population levels according to certain binary computer models, which was the great innovation of the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth project. That was popularized on the biggest platform for the first time in 1973, consciously by Prince Bernhard. Prince Bernhard also, for those who don't know, was the co-founder of the Bilderberger Group, a former Nazi officer himself. And the Bilderberger Group was a globalists organizing committee that had set itself up in 1954 to meet annually every year as part of just a useful mechanism of coordinating international policy around doing what Hitler failed to do in the 1930s and 40s, which was subvert the sovereign nation-state system and institute a structure of global fascist regimes controlling regional districts of the earth under fascist power, imposing itself onto the population of the earth, but always under the generalized control of a unipolar central command. In this case, it would have been, in the 30s and 40s, the City of London. The Bank of International Settlements being a key instrument in the growth, the grooming, the growth, the incubation, and the deployment of fascism before and after the war. So all that to say, this is what Prince Bernhard was deployed to do. He also was busy in 1961, Bernhard, co-founding a new organization known as the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, along with 2 fellows, one of whom was Prince Philip Mountbatten, a guy who was trained in a Nazi-managed educational program in high school, with 4 sisters who all went on to marry Nazi SS officers, Prince Philip, and was trained also by his uncle, Mountbatten, I forgot his first name all of a sudden, the figure who was assigned as both a rampant pedophile but also imperialist of India to manage the so-called liberation of India, but the schisming of India into a better, more regionalized zone of Pakistan versus Hindu-Sikh India to be better divided to be conquered in the post-war age. So all that to say, Prince Philip was the other figure who co-founded the World Wildlife Fund with Prince Bernhard. Julian Huxley was the third. And the idea of this organization was to essentially shift